Hey everybody, this is your Right Geek, honorary man king, and leader of the Awkward Cough Squad, here with another video. Today I'm going to share with you my little Twitter thread that I wrote up the other day once I got wind of the Iron Man relaunch announcement for the Iron Man comics that is slated to take place in September. So I had some opinions on that, as you're probably no doubt predicting. As someone who has read a metric crap ton of Iron Man comics, there were aspects of that announcement that rather frustrated me. So I have some feelings on the subject, and I'm just going to read the thread for you for this video. So I just saw an announcement on an Iron Man relaunch that promises a, quote, back-to-basics approach. Might I make a few suggestions? First of all, avoid anything that makes him OP. I prefer Tony to be a baseline human who's vulnerable to being seriously wounded despite the armor. And in the announcement there does seem to suggest that he's going back to less of a high-tech approach, and if that's the case, that might be good. Two, on that subject, it might be nice to give him another ongoing medical malady. Speaking for myself, the reason I connected to Tony in the first place was that Silver Age weak heart. Basically, in the early days, that armor that he created was initially a metaphorical wheelchair. It was a great way to represent chronic illness and disability without being on the nose about it. So if we could bring back that kind of initial aspect of the character, but just in a different way, if we could explore again that contrast that happens in the main era Iron Man comics between the strength and power of the Iron Man persona versus the vulnerability and weakness of Tony Stark as a human being. If we could bring that back, I think you might be able to get some interesting stories out of it. Number 3, emphasize his ingenuity. Like, really go hard on that. Force him to survive without the armor sometimes. Put him in situations in which he has to rely on his brains instead of his tech-assisted strength. Remember, he can make jets out of sand and cactus needles. Use that potential. In the main era, a lot of the comics that kind of fall into my favorites category are basically out-of-the-armor comics, where he has to figure out how to get himself out of a sticky situation without the assistance of his tech. I love those stories so much because it really hammers home the fact that it's not the armor that makes Iron Man the hero, it's the man inside and his intelligence and his ingenuity. So go back to that theme. 4, here's the thing that really bothered me about the announcement. The announcement mentions his ego, it mentions his arrogance, but in my opinion, that vastly oversimplifies Tony Stark. Yes, he is prone to thinking he can have absolute control over his tech, his fate, the future, and so on. But the interesting thing about having that tendency, having that aspect, is that when things do inevitably go wrong, because he can't, in fact, have control over everything as much as he might want to have control, when things go wrong, he tends to blame himself, because he thinks that he can control all future outcomes just through his own intelligence. When he ultimately fails to exercise that control, now becomes now it becomes something that he hates himself for, and he becomes insanely self-critical about the fact that he could not see this thing coming, or that he could not prevent this terrible outcome. So the so-called arrogance that people keep talking about when it comes to this character, it has this interesting flip side where he's arrogant, but he's also self-loathing, because because the arrogance, he has these insanely high expectations of what he is capable of doing as a human being. And when he doesn't meet those insanely high expectations, then he excoriates himself for that failure. Really, throughout his canon, one of the most common things that Tony will say is, my fault. I have to deal with this because it's my fault. And, and occasionally it is in fact his fault, but occasionally he will take on the fault, he will take on the blame for things that aren't actually in his control, as much as he thinks that everything is in his control. So, and then 5, as a result of the constant undercurrent of self-criticism that is in this character, he doesn't really value his own life that much. And you can see this all throughout his canon. How many times has he faced the prospect of death with a shrug and a declaration that it's worth it? And the answer, hint, it's a lot. And it starts from the very beginning of his existence as a character. There's a very, very early Tales of Suspense story, actually, where he's fighting with a particular villain, and in order to defeat the villain, he has to send off an electric pulse that is going to disable his armor along with the villain's tech. And the villain's like, if you do that, you will disable yourself too. And Tony's response is basically, it's basically, haha, funny, you should think that I actually care about my own life. That's not exactly what he says, but that's essentially what he says. He's like, oh well, gotta go sometime, and he pulls the switch. And, and, that was very early on. And then you can fast forward up to some of the 21st century comics, like, in the Execute Program arc, in the beginning of Volume 4, when his tech is going bananas because someone has hijacked his Extremis brain. What does he decide to do in order to solve that situation? Well, he decides to basically kill himself. He stops his own heart, and he's dead for a little while so that all the tech will stop going snake shit. So, many, many times throughout his canon, if there's a problem, Tony will often say, okay, the solution to the problem is to kill myself or injure myself, because that's the only thing that will stop it. So, if you're going to reboot him, bring back that aspect as well. He does not value his own life. He will, if given a choice between I die or someone else die, he's always going to pick I die, no matter what. Or as one of my friends said, the only reason why someone who is that smart does not turn into a supervillain is because I die or I get hurt is far, far, far above someone else gets hurt in his list of possible side effects. So, he's got that suicidal sort of self-destructive tendency that any new version of Tony Stark should really bring back. 6. While Tony is much more of a pragmatist than, say, Steve Rogers, who's very much idealistic, he still has a moral compass. I honestly cannot stress that enough. There are lines that Tony Stark will not cross, and things that he will not abide. And honestly, each time he gets put in a situation in which the options, in his view, are A, a shitty option, and B, a slightly less shitty option, he will choose the slightly less shitty option, in his view, but he will hate himself for it. So, in the early part of Jonathan Hickman's kind of new Avengers run, where we had the universes crashing together, the incursions, and Tony was building like planet killers in order to stop these incursions from destroying the 616 universe. What you notice in that storyline is he's willing to do the kind of morally gray thing if he thinks it's going to prevent something worse, but the entire time he's doing it, he is intensely unhappy about doing it. He absolutely, like I said here in this thread, he will build the planet killer if he thinks that it's necessary to prevent something worse, but he will hate it and himself the entire time he's doing it. So if you put him in situations where he has to choose between the rock and a hard place, just keep in mind that even when he's making a choice that say an idealist like Steve Rogers would not make, he still kind of has that idealistic soul that wishes that he wouldn't have to make those choices. And you should definitely emphasize that if he's making the sort of pragmatic consequentialist choice that he thinks is going to work out into a better future, even though right now it's terrible and horrible and it asks him to do things that he feels are not morally correct, the whole time he's going to feel guilty about it. So don't forget that when you write that character. But because those kinds of pragmatic decisions are so agonizing, please give him a break sometimes. Let him make some choices that are actually easy every once in a while. Put him into some situations that are a little more morally clear, so that he's not spending his entire life in guilt and pain or agonizing over the decisions he has to make. Let him have a little bit of fun. Bring back some of the card juggling and shark wrestling and stuff like that you would see in, say, the Tales of Suspense run that was written by Stan Lee. Don't forget the fun aspect, because, as much as I like the angst, humor and fun should be in comics too, so don't forget that. Other things. Tony loves kids, values his employees, this is important, and is a massive dork who sweet talks his tech and goes gaga over King Arthur, among other things. So you have, in the early comics, he'll say, "Here are my little transistors." He's such a doofus about it. He loves his little tech, and he treats it like they're little pets or human, little children that he has, and then actual real human children he adores as well. So don't forget that aspect about him too. And lastly, never forget that Tony is fundamentally animated by the desire to secure the future of humanity and make the world a progressively better place. In the 80s, he built a space station. Maybe now he can build starships. So that's how I closed up that thread. There is, even though he will make, like I keep saying, he will make the pragmatic choice that is, perhaps what you would call morally gray. It's not the morally idealistic choice. Always in the front of his vision is the idea that I want to make the future better. I want to make sure, I want to protect the world, and I want to protect my friends. And that's his animating motivation the entire time. It's not about soothing his own ego, because, you know, even though he has an ego and he has some element of arrogance, it's not about aggrandizing himself. It's about improving the world. He is a progressive in the classical sense, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. In fact, we should bring that aspect in. Like I said, have him build starships, have him think about space colonies and environmentally friendly tech, and how can we maybe solve the problem of world hunger or something like that. These are things that would excite him as someone who's so future oriented. So bring that aspect into the comics as well, and don't just focus on, oh, he has an ego. That is like one tiny element of the character. There is so much more to him, so please don't oversimplify him in that way. Okay, I'm done. I have lots of feelings about Tony Stark. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. If you have any comments or questions or input on this particular topic, please comment below, and I will speak to you again on Thursday.